Nathan Cole, a battle-worn veteran struggling to rebuild his life, was walking his loyal German Shepherd Bear through the icy back trails of St. Paul, Minnesota, when something unthinkable happened. Bear suddenly froze, ears stiff, then bolted toward the snow-covered riverbank, barking louder than Nathan had ever heard before. Confused and breathless, Nathan chased after him, and that's when he saw it. A tiny blue blanket, half buried in drifting snow beneath a leaning pine tree. At first, Nathan thought it was just trash, until he heard it. A sharp, desperate cry, high-pitched, raw, and trembling. Heart pounding, Nathan knelt down and pulled the blanket open, revealing a newborn baby, skin flushed red from the freezing air, tiny fists clenched, crying out for life. From that moment on, nothing in Nathan's life, or this little boy's, would ever be the same. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in miracles. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far this story of hope and second chances can reach. Snow drifted lazily over St. Paul, Minnesota, blanketing the quiet city in soft white under the dim winter moonlight. The Mississippi River lay frozen beneath a thin layer of ice, its surface glimmering faintly beneath scattered clouds. Nathan Cole, a 44-year-old veteran, walked slowly along a narrow trail near the riverbank, boots crunching softly over the fresh powder. He stood about 6 feet tall, with a sturdy frame that had grown leaner over the years, his posture slightly slouched under the quiet weight of grief. His brown hair, streaked prematurely with gray, peeked from beneath a faded wool beanie. A rough beard traced his strong jawline, and his pale blue eyes, once sharp and commanding, now carried a heaviness born from too many losses. Too many ghosts. Nathan had served 14 years in the U.S. Army, enduring the blistering deserts of Afghanistan and the constant threat of death. Yet, strangely, his worst battles hadn't been fought overseas. They came when he came home. 6 years ago, on a cold January night like this one, his 5-year-old daughter Lily was killed in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. The memory was a wound that never healed. He could still hear her laughter in quiet moments, still see her tiny hands reaching for him, still feel the hollow in his chest where her presence used to be. His wife, Marissa, had tried to hold on after Lily's death, but grief is a slow poison. Conversations turned to silence, shared glances became distant, and one day she packed her things without a word. She left for Seattle, leaving Nathan in a home filled with echoes of a life that no longer existed. He didn't blame her. In her absence, he found himself buried beneath loneliness so deep it swallowed every sound except his own breath. If it weren't for Bear, Nathan sometimes thought, he might not have survived. Bear was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, large and powerful, with a thick black and tan coat and intelligent amber eyes. At nearly 90 pounds, he moved with silent precision, muscles shifting beneath his winter coat. Nathan had rescued him from a shelter 3 years ago, and since then, Bear had become more than a companion. He was family. Loyal, steady, always there when the silence in Nathan's cabin threatened to suffocate him. Tonight, they walked the river path as they always did when the weight of memory became too heavy. Nathan liked these nights, when the world seemed quieter, where his boots sinking into fresh snow filled the emptiness with rhythm. But Bear was tense tonight. Nathan noticed the way his ears twitched with every sound, the restless way his tail swayed low and tight, and the way his nose lifted constantly, scenting something Nathan couldn't yet sense. Nathan's breath formed soft clouds in the cool night air. His gloved hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn leather jacket. He tried to push away the familiar ache inside his chest. The thoughts of Lily, the guilt of surviving when she hadn't, the ache of a life that had slipped through his hands like melting ice. Then it happened. Bear froze mid-step, one paw raised above the snow, his entire body locked in tension. His ears pricked forward, tail stiff, and a low rumble built in his throat. Nathan stopped instantly, his instincts from years of deployment kicking in. "What is it, boy?" he whispered, lowering his voice. Bear didn't respond. In the next heartbeat, he bolted, claws digging into the soft snow as he tore down the narrow path, his deep bark erupting into the silence of the winter night. Nathan's breath caught, and his pulse surged as he broke into a sprint after him, boots slipping slightly on the frosted path. He knew Bear well. He wasn't the kind of dog to spook without reason. Whatever had set him off was real. Bear's powerful frame cut through the white haze, racing toward the small wooden bridge that stretched across a narrow inlet of the Mississippi. Nathan ran harder, his lungs stinging from the cold air as he chased the sound of frantic barking. And then, just ahead, through the soft whirling snow, Nathan saw Bear standing at the edge of the bridge, hackles raised, his body tense as he barked furiously into the shadows below. Nathan slowed, heart pounding, confusion flooding his chest as he tried to make sense of what Bear had found. Whatever it was, Nathan could feel it in his bones. This night was about to change everything. Nathan's lungs burned as he reached the small wooden bridge where Bear stood stiff, barking furiously into the shadows beneath. His heart pounded hard, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Then he saw it, a small blue wool blanket, half buried beneath a mound of snow under the leaning pine tree. Without hesitation, Nathan slid down the icy slope, his boots skidding slightly, and knelt beside the bundle. Carefully pulling it open, his breath caught in his throat. Inside lay a newborn baby boy, no more than a few days old. His tiny face flushed deep pink from the cold, tiny fists clenched, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. A sharp cry escaped the infant, piercing the still air like a fragile plea for life. Nathan's stomach knotted tightly as the ghost of his daughter Lily swept over him. The same helplessness, the same need to protect. Without thinking, he stripped off his scarf and wrapped the baby snugly, tucking him gently against his chest beneath his jacket, using his own body heat to warm the fragile child. Bear whimpered softly, his sharp amber eyes locked on the baby, as if sensing the urgency of the moment. Nathan glanced around the frozen banks, scanning for movement, footprints, anything. But the storm had erased every trace. Whoever left the child here was long gone. He rose to his feet, clutching the baby close, and whispered hoarsely, "I've got you, little one. Hold on." Turning sharply, he called Bear to his side, and together they hurried back toward the trail, boots crunching heavily against the fresh snow. Within 20 minutes, Nathan reached his old pickup truck, parked along the quiet road, its windshield rimmed with frost. He carefully settled the baby on the worn passenger seat, ensuring the scarf held tight, then climbed in, cranking the heater to its highest setting. Bear hopped into the back seat, pacing anxiously, his nails clicking against the vinyl as the soft wail of the baby filled the cab. Nathan clenched the steering wheel, his jaw tight, adrenaline still surging through his veins. One thought consumed him: Regions Hospital. By the time Nathan pulled into the emergency parking lot, red and white lights glared against the snow-covered pavement. Inside, the hospital was bright and warm, a stark contrast to the frozen world outside. Nathan pushed through the sliding doors, holding the baby close, Bear following behind, his thick fur dusted white with melting snow. The nurses at the reception desk immediately reacted, rushing forward. "Please, help him," Nathan said, his voice unsteady. A nurse quickly took the baby from his arms, whisking him toward the neonatal unit. Bear sat obediently at Nathan's feet, ears twitching, his head tilted as if tracking every sound. As Nathan exhaled, trying to steady himself, a deep voice interrupted the fragile calm. "Mr. Cole, is it?" Nathan turned and found himself face to face with Sheriff Thomas Reed, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s. He stood at about 6'1", his salt and pepper hair cropped close to his head, a neatly trimmed beard framing a square jaw. His hazel eyes were sharp beneath heavy brows, scanning Nathan with the intensity of someone trained to doubt everything. Thomas's thick parka bore the worn badge of the Ramsey County Sheriff's Office over his chest, and his leather gloves creaked as he folded his arms. "Yes," Nathan replied cautiously, his breath visible in the warm air. "I'm going to need you to explain," Thomas said, his voice deep and steady. "You're telling me you just happened to find a newborn baby out there in this weather?" Nathan stiffened, instinctively defensive. "That's exactly what happened. I was walking Bear along the river trail. He started barking, and I found him under the bridge." Thomas studied him carefully, expression unreadable. "Mm-hmm. And you didn't see anyone else nearby? No vehicles, no footprints?" "Nothing. The snow covered everything." Thomas's gaze dropped briefly to Bear, then back to Nathan. "You live alone, right? No family here?" Nathan clenched his jaw but nodded. "That's right." The sheriff's tone hardened slightly. I ask because when someone finds a newborn in the middle of a snowstorm, there are questions, especially when that someone lives out on the edge of town, off by himself. Nathan's pale blue eyes narrowed, irritation flashing. You think I put him there? Thomas raised a hand, calm but firm. I didn't say that. But I need to consider every possibility. A baby abandoned in freezing temperatures is a crime, Mr. Cole. We need to know where he came from. Before Nathan could reply, a voice called from behind them. Sheriff Reed? Mr. Cole? We need to talk about the baby. Nathan turned to see Dr. Laura Whitman approaching, holding a tablet against her chest. Laura was in her mid-30s, slender but tall, with shoulder-length auburn hair tucked neatly behind her ears. Her porcelain skin contrasted sharply against the navy scrubs beneath her white coat, and her sharp green eyes carried a cool, clinical focus, softened only by a quiet compassion. Laura stopped in front of them, glancing briefly at Nathan before addressing the sheriff. The baby's stable, early hypothermia, but we managed to get his body temperature back up. He's hydrated, responsive, and otherwise healthy. Relief washed through Nathan, and he exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging. Thank God, he muttered under his breath. Laura shifted the tablet in her hands. Here's the strange part. The child's been well cared for. He's clean, no signs of neglect or malnutrition. His nails are trimmed, his skin moisturized, and from the formula residue we found, he's been properly fed up until today. Whoever left him out there didn't abandon him because they didn't care. She paused, glancing between Nathan and the sheriff. This wasn't neglect. This was desperation. Thomas frowned, scratching his beard thoughtfully. So, someone loved that kid enough to care for him, and still left him to die in the snow? Laura's lips pressed into a thin line. Exactly. That's what makes this so concerning. As they spoke, Bear sat planted near Nathan's boots, his head low, ears twitching, his amber eyes locked on the neonatal room where the baby rested. Nathan crouched beside him, running a hand down his thick fur. He felt Bear's steady breathing beneath his palm, grounding him, even as his chest tightened with unease. He could hear whispers behind him, two older women near the reception counter, murmuring just loud enough for him to catch fragments. That's Nathan Cole, isn't it? Lives alone in that cabin. Poor man. But you never know. Strange he found a baby, don't you think? Nathan's jaw tensed, his throat dry. He hated this town sometimes. He hated the way people remembered his tragedies more than his humanity. To them, he wasn't a man who'd served his country. He was the loner who'd lost his daughter, whose wife had walked out, who lived out by the river because he couldn't face the empty streets where Lily once played. Thomas finally closed his notepad, though his sharp gaze lingered. We'll need you to stay in town for a few days, Mr. Cole. My deputies may need to follow up with questions. Until we figure out who left that baby out there, you're part of this investigation. Nathan swallowed hard, nodding reluctantly. I understand. Laura offered a faint, reassuring smile. For now, he's safe. That's what matters most. But as Nathan turned to glance through the glass panel into the neonatal room, his chest tightened again. Inside, the tiny baby slept beneath soft white blankets, cheeks rosy now, breath steady. Bear shifted beside him, letting out a quiet whine, as if sensing his unease. Nathan didn't know why, but deep inside, he felt a strange connection to the child, one he couldn't explain. He didn't know yet what role this boy would play in his life. But as he looked into the glass and saw the small, fragile form sleeping peacefully, he knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't over. The wind whispered softly across the Mississippi as Nathan Cole parked his old pickup along the snowy shoulder of the trail. The memory of the newborn's faint cries still haunted him, playing on a loop inside his mind. Despite Sheriff Thomas Reed's warnings to stay put, Nathan couldn't sit in his cabin knowing there were unanswered questions. He needed to understand who had left that child beneath the bridge, and why. Bear sat in the passenger seat beside him, his black and tan coat bristling slightly, amber eyes glowing with alertness. The German shepherd seemed to sense Nathan's turmoil, his ears twitching at every gust of wind. The riverbank where Nathan had found the baby was quiet now, blanketed by soft powder under the fading light. The temperature was milder than the night before, just cold enough to sting but not enough to numb, -8 degrees Celsius. Nathan crouched low, his boots sinking into the loose snow as Bear padded beside him, nose close to the ground. "Find it, buddy," he murmured softly, watching Bear's body stiffen as the dog caught a scent. Bear led him off the main trail and into a small clearing near the water's edge, where the snow seemed slightly disturbed. Nathan scanned the ground carefully until his eyes caught a faint line of indentations beneath the thin layer of ice-crusted snow. Kneeling, he brushed the surface with his gloved hand. Footprints. Faint, but real. They were small, deliberate steps, heading deeper into the trees. For over an hour, Nathan and Bear tracked the faint trail, weaving through skeletal pines until Bear stopped abruptly, his ears forward, nose pressed low against the snow. Ahead of them was a small hollow, partially hidden by a cluster of fallen branches. Nathan pushed them aside and froze. A makeshift camp. Inside the hollow sat a small, collapsed lean-to made of broken twigs and tarp fragments. A threadbare wool blanket, stiff with frost, was half buried beneath the snow. Nearby lay 2 empty baby formula bottles, tipped over on their sides, the faded labels peeling from dampness. Scattered around the shelter were a handful of tiny baby socks, a torn page from a formula instruction guide, and a pair of cracked glass jars that once held water. Nathan's gaze moved to something darker against the white, a smear of dried blood on the snow just beyond the blanket. He crouched low, his chest tightening. It wasn't the chaotic splatter of violence. It was deliberate, controlled. Someone had been sick here. He brushed the surface carefully and found faint flecks of tissue mixed into the frozen stain. Whoever had stayed here had been coughing up blood. He swallowed hard, his breath catching as realization set in. Whoever had cared for the baby had done everything they could to keep him alive, feeding him, warming him, sheltering him, and all while battling an illness that was slowly killing them. Bear whined softly, nudging Nathan's elbow with his cold nose, as if sensing his rising unease. Nathan placed a hand on the German shepherd's neck, steadying himself. "Whoever you are," he whispered under his breath, "you didn't leave him because you didn't love him. You left him because you couldn't stay." Nathan stood slowly, scanning the clearing again. His gaze landed on something half buried beneath a thin sheet of ice, a small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked from the cold. He pulled it free, carefully brushing off the snow. Inside, the first pages were blank, but toward the middle, a name had been scrawled hastily in uneven handwriting. Ethan Parker. Nathan frowned deeply, his pulse quickening. Was this the name of the baby? Or the person caring for him? Flipping a few pages further, he found entries written with shaky, uneven penmanship. Most of the words were smudged and nearly illegible, but fragments stood out. Sophia. Fever getting worse. Milk running out. Can't make it to town. A name. A woman. A fever. Pieces of a story began to take shape. One Nathan couldn't yet fit together, but the connection was undeniable. Someone had fought desperately to keep this baby alive, even as their own body was failing them. A twig snapped somewhere behind him. Nathan spun instinctively, his breath clouding the cold air, scanning the shadows among the trees. Bear growled low, stepping forward, his body tense. From between the tall pines, a young deputy emerged, his flashlight cutting a thin beam through the snow. "Mr. Cole," the deputy called softly, lowering his light as he approached. The young man introduced himself. Deputy Mark Rivers, mid-20s, lean but fit, standing just under 6 feet. He had a sharp jawline and dark blonde hair tucked beneath a sheriff's department beanie. His pale gray eyes were cautious but not hostile, and he carried himself like someone still finding his footing in a career overshadowed by veterans like Sheriff Reed. "Sheriff sent me to find you," Mark said, breathing heavily from the cold. "He figured you'd come back here. He wasn't wrong." Nathan stiffened, tucking the journal inside his jacket. "I came to see if there was anything left to explain why that baby was out here." Mark glanced around the clearing, his flashlight grazing over the bottles, the blanket, the blood stains, his brows furrowed. "Looks like whoever was here, they didn't just leave him. This doesn't look like someone walked away without caring." Nathan nodded slowly. "Exactly." Mark hesitated, his breath puffing little clouds into the air. "I shouldn't tell you this, but there's chatter at the station. The sheriff still thinks you're hiding something. Folks downtown are whispering too. They think it's odd that you just happen to be there." Nathan clenched his jaw, swallowing his frustration. I don't care what they think. All I care about is finding out who was out here, why they left him, and if they're still alive." The young deputy studied Nathan's face for a moment before nodding. "I believe you," he said quietly, his tone carrying the weight of someone who hadn't yet been hardened by cynicism. Bear gave a sharp bark, breaking the silence. Nathan turned quickly, scanning the nearby tree line. Through the shifting snowfall, he spotted a faint drag mark trailing away from the camp, like someone had been pulling themselves through the snow. Without a word, Nathan and Bear followed it for a short distance until it disappeared beneath a cluster of fresh powder. The trail had gone cold, but Nathan had seen enough to know this wasn't over. Standing at the edge of the clearing, he looked back one last time at the remnants of the small camp. The formula bottles, the blood, the blanket folded carefully instead of abandoned in chaos. Whoever had been here had fought harder than anyone Nathan had ever seen on the battlefield. But eventually, they had reached the limit of what their body could endure. Nathan placed a hand on Bear's neck, grounding himself against the swirl of questions tightening inside his chest. "We'll find them," he murmured softly, almost like a promise. Bear pressed his head briefly into Nathan's palm, as if agreeing. With the journal tucked securely inside his jacket, Nathan began the long walk back toward the truck, the crunch of his boots in Bear's paws, the only sound breaking the quiet winter air. Somewhere, someone's story was unfinished, and Nathan knew he wasn't walking away from it now. The sun was low on the horizon, its pale light cutting across the snowy treetops as Nathan, Cole, and Bear pressed deeper into the woods. The faint drag marks Nathan had found near the abandoned camp in Chapter 3 had nearly vanished beneath fresh snowfall, but Bear's powerful nose kept them on the trail. The German shepherd's breath puffed in steady bursts, his black and tan coat blending into the patches of shadow among the trees. Nathan followed closely, his boots crunching over ice, the journal he had discovered tucked securely inside his jacket. The woods grew quieter the further they went, muffled by layers of snow blanketing the ground. Nathan's pulse thudded in his ears as he thought about the fragments he'd read in the journal, the scrawled name Ethan Parker, references to Sophia, and the smudged lines about milk running out. Everything pointed to someone who had fought desperately to keep the baby alive. Now, Nathan needed to know if that person was still out here, or if he was already too late. After nearly 40 minutes of navigating through clusters of frozen pines, Bear stopped abruptly, his ears stiff, his amber gaze fixed ahead. Nathan followed his line of sight and spotted a faint column of smoke curling upward from the trees. Heart pounding, Nathan quickened his pace until he reached a small clearing where a dilapidated wooden cabin leaned precariously under the weight of snow on its sagging roof. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, one corner splintered from repeated slamming against the frame. A makeshift path had been carved through the snow, leading to the cabin, but no new footprints marked the surface. Nathan exchanged a glance with Bear, who lowered his head and let out a low, uneasy growl. Pushing the door open slowly, Nathan stepped inside. The air inside was warmer than expected, but thick with the acrid smell of smoke and sickness. A small fire burned weakly in the corner, barely enough to push back the cold that seeped through the cracked walls. A pile of blankets lay crumpled near the fireplace, and beneath them, a man stirred weakly. James Parker looked to be in his mid-30s but appeared decades older. His once broad shoulders were now narrow beneath layers of mismatched coats. His skin pale and waxy beneath the weak glow of firelight. Sweat dampened his temples despite the cold, and a coarse, unkempt beard covered his gaunt face. His cracked lips trembled slightly as he tried to sit up, and the motion triggered a violent fit of coughing. He clutched his chest with one trembling hand as deep, rattling coughs racked his thin frame, flecks of blood staining the cloth pressed against his mouth. Bear approached slowly, his claws clicking softly against the wooden floor, head tilted, sniffing the air. Nathan knelt beside the man, carefully placing a hand on his shoulder. "James Parker?" Nathan asked, his voice low but steady. The man's faded hazel eyes opened halfway, dazed but aware. He nodded faintly, his breath shallow. "You found him?" James rasped, his voice hoarse and broken. Nathan's chest tightened. "The baby? Yes, he's safe. He's at Regent's Hospital. They're taking care of him." At the mention of the baby, a faint, relieved smile spread across James's lips, though his eyes welled with tears. "Thank God," he whispered, his voice fading to a whisper. He coughed again, wincing before continuing. "His name? Ethan. My son?" Nathan sat back on his heels, letting the weight of those words settle. He studied James more closely, noticing the deep hollows under his cheekbones, the prominent veins in his hands, and the faint, constant rattle in his breathing. "You've been sick a long time?" Nathan said quietly. James gave a short, bitter laugh before it dissolved into another coughing fit. "Lung cancer," he admitted, voice ragged. "Stage 4, been dying for months." He closed his eyes briefly, gathering what strength he had left. "Grace, my wife, she didn't make it. She died giving birth. After that, it was just me and Ethan." He reached into the pile of blankets and pulled out a small leather pouch with shaking hands. Inside were a few folded papers, worn and creased from handling. Nathan unfolded them carefully and saw a set of legal adoption papers, signed and notarized, with James Parker listed as Ethan's biological father, but leaving the adoptive parent's name blank. James's voice cracked as he explained. "I knew I wouldn't last long, couldn't give him what he needed. Milk's gone, money's gone. I couldn't watch him die." His hands trembled harder as he pressed the papers into Nathan's hands. "I waited until I knew people walked near the bridge. I left him where someone good would find him." His hazel eyes locked on Nathan's pale blue gaze, pleading without words. Nathan's throat tightened, his voice barely steady. "You thought of everything. Even this." James coughed, his shoulders shaking violently until he slumped back, exhausted. "I had to," he whispered. "Ethan deserves a chance." He shifted weakly, turning his gaze toward the journal sticking out of Nathan's jacket. "You found it, didn't you?" Nathan nodded. "I did. I read some of it. You tried so hard to keep him alive." A single tear slid down James's cheek, cutting through the grime. "I tried. Everything," he murmured. "Kept the fire going, rationed every drop of milk. I even prayed, though I stopped believing years ago. But I guess God sent you." Bear settled near the blankets, resting his head on his paws, watching silently with soft amber eyes. Nathan stroked the dog's fur absent-mindedly, grounding himself as James's words sank in. James struggled to prop himself up slightly. His breathing labored. "Promise me something, Nathan." Nathan leaned forward, gripping the papers tightly. "Anything. If they'll let you, if you can, be his father. Don't let him grow up thinking he was unwanted. Tell him his mother loved him, and I loved him enough to let him go." Nathan hesitated, the weight of the request pressing on him. He thought of Lily, her bright smile, the way she used to wrap her tiny arms around his neck, and the emptiness she left behind. He looked at James, at the hollow desperation in his sunken face, and nodded firmly. "I promise," he said softly. James exhaled shakily, the faintest smile curling his lips as his eyelids fluttered shut. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, each one sounding more fragile than the last. Nathan adjusted the blankets carefully around him, knowing he needed medical attention, but also knowing time might already be slipping away. The fire popped softly in the corner, and the cabin settled into silence, broken only by James's shallow breathing and the faint wind whistling through cracks in the walls. Nathan glanced at Bear, who met his gaze as if understanding the weight of the moment. Clutching the adoption papers in his hand, Nathan stood slowly, looking down at the frail man who had fought so hard for his son. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, covering the old footprints, erasing the traces of the choices James had made. But Nathan knew this story was far from over. Tonight, he had Ethan's name. Now, he had his father's wish. The drive back to Regions Hospital was silent, except for the steady hum of Nathan's old pickup and the rhythmic panting of Bear in the back seat. The snow had slowed to a soft, drifting fall, but the roads remained slick under a thin layer of ice. Beside him, James Parker sat slumped against the door, his breath shallow and uneven. Nathan had wrapped him in an extra blanket from the cabin, but James's skin still held the pale translucence of a man clinging to the last threads of strength. Nathan glanced at him, tightening his grip on the wheel, silently urging him to hold on. Bear shifted restlessly in the back, his black and tan coat glistening with melted flakes, amber eyes watching Nathan closely, as if sensing the tension weighing on him. Nathan reached back briefly, resting his gloved hand on Bear's neck. "We're almost there, buddy," he whispered. When they arrived, the hospital entrance was brighter than the last time Nathan had walked through its sliding doors. The warm air inside met them instantly, and a pair of nurses rushed forward with a gurney to take James. He tried to protest faintly but was quickly guided toward the ICU. Nathan hesitated for a moment, his chest tight as he watched James disappear down the corridor. Before he could gather his thoughts, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the hospital noise. "Mr. Cole?" Nathan turned to see Sheriff Thomas Reed striding toward him, his tall frame commanding as ever, his heavy winter parka unzipped to reveal the worn sheriff's badge on his chest. His salt and pepper beard looked freshly trimmed, but his hazel eyes remained sharp, calculating, and just a little too cold for Nathan's liking. "I heard you brought someone in," Thomas said, his deep voice steady but laced with suspicion. "A man who claims to be the father?" Nathan exhaled, bracing himself. "Not claims, Sheriff. James Parker, Ethan's father. He's in bad shape. Lung cancer, stage 4. He told me everything." Thomas's jaw flexed, his arms crossing firmly. "I'll need a statement. And those papers he gave you, the adoption documents. Until we verify them, the court won't recognize anything." Nathan felt the weight of the folded papers in his jacket pocket, his knuckles tightening around the fabric. He'd expected resistance, but the thought of bureaucracy standing between Ethan and safety knotted his stomach. "I'll give you what I have," Nathan said quietly, "but James doesn't have much time." Before Thomas could respond, a soft voice broke in. "Mr. Cole, Ethan's asking for a feeding." Nathan turned to see Emma Hayes, a young nurse in her late 20s, standing just outside the neonatal unit. Emma had a petite frame, standing about 5'4", with light brown wavy hair tied back loosely, warm hazel eyes, and pale freckled skin. She wore soft blue scrubs under a white cardigan, and her gentle demeanor radiated an unspoken calm. Unlike Thomas, there was no suspicion in her gaze, only quiet empathy. "I'll help you," she said softly, gesturing for Nathan to follow her. Inside the neonatal room, the air was warmer, almost hushed, as soft lullabies played faintly through ceiling speakers. Ethan Parker, the newborn Nathan had found under the bridge, lay swaddled in fresh blankets inside a small crib. His cheeks had regained their rosy color, but his tiny chest still rose and fell in delicate, uneven breaths. Bear sat patiently by the glass partition, watching with quiet focus, his ears twitching with every sound. Emma handed Nathan a warmed bottle and showed him how to hold the baby properly. Nathan's rough, calloused hands trembled slightly as he cradled the tiny boy, his blue eyes softening as he watched Ethan's small lips latch onto the bottle. "You're a natural," Emma whispered, a small smile tugging at her lips. Nathan managed a weak laugh. "Haven't held one this small since Lily." His voice faltered as memories flooded him. Lily's laughter, the warmth of her hand gripping his finger, the unbearable silence that came after losing her. Emma caught the tremor in his tone, but didn't press. Instead, she placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "He's lucky you found him," she said softly. Nathan didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on Ethan's tiny face. A part of him wanted to believe Emma's words, but another part twisted with uncertainty. He was a 44-year-old man, living paycheck to paycheck from odd jobs, barely scraping enough to keep his cabin standing. He had lost his wife, lost his daughter, and buried pieces of himself long before tonight. Could he really give Ethan the life James wanted for him? Sheriff Reed's voice interrupted his thoughts as the man stepped into the room, his boots clicking softly against the tile. "Mr. Cole, we're not done talking," he said firmly, glancing at the baby before turning back to Nathan. "Even if those papers are real, you'll need court approval, background checks, financial reviews, the whole process." Nathan bristled but kept his tone even. "I'm not thinking about courts right now. I'm thinking about what happens to Ethan if James doesn't make it through the night." Thomas hesitated briefly, his sharp gaze softening for just a moment before he nodded curtly. "Fine, but don't make promises you can't keep, Cole. That boy's future depends on more than good intentions." When Thomas left, the room settled into quiet again, broken only by Ethan's soft sucking sounds. Nathan sat in the rocking chair beside the crib, Bear curling up loyally at his feet, his thick tail flicking gently against the tile. He stared at the tiny child nestled against his chest, and a storm of conflicting emotions churned inside him. Grief, fear, longing, and something dangerously close to hope. Emma pulled up a chair beside him, watching him thoughtfully. "You don't have to decide today," she said gently, sensing his turmoil. "But I can tell you this much, Mr. Cole. Babies need more than safety. They need love. And from where I'm sitting, Ethan already has that with you." Nathan looked down at Ethan's tiny hand resting against his shirt, curling instinctively as though grasping for something familiar. He swallowed hard, unable to find the words. Somewhere deep inside, he knew Emma was right, but doubts gnawed at the edges of his mind. Could he really fill the void James would leave? Could he give this boy the home he deserved when his own life was barely holding together? Nathan leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the room and the soft weight of Ethan's small body settle into him. Bear's steady breathing rumbled gently at his feet, grounding him in the silence. He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew one thing. Whatever decision he made would shape not just Ethan's future, but his own. Snow drifted lazily outside the wide hospital windows, the lights of St. Paul casting faint halos against the glass as the storm began to settle. Inside Regions Hospital, the corridors were hushed, the air thick with the weight of things unsaid. Nathan Cole sat outside the ICU, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers interlocked, his pale blue eyes staring blankly at the tiled floor. Bear, his loyal German shepherd, lay curled at his feet, the black and tan fur on his shoulders rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Bear's amber eyes followed every passerby, alert yet calm, sensing the heaviness around them. Nathan hadn't realized how tightly he was gripping the adoption papers until his knuckles ached. He'd promised James he would take care of Ethan, but the reality of it pressed down on him like the weight of the falling snow. At 44, he didn't have a savings account big enough to lean on, didn't have a family home, or even much of a plan. He had nothing but Bear, his old truck, and a heart full of ghosts. The sound of soft footsteps broke the silence. Nathan looked up to see Emma Hayes, the young nurse who had been helping care for Ethan, standing by the doorframe. Her light brown hair was tied into a loose braid, and strands framed her pale, freckled face. Her hazel eyes carried exhaustion, but also a quiet kindness that Nathan was starting to depend on. "Mr. Cole," she said gently, "James is asking for you." Nathan rose without a word, Bear following at his side until Emma crouched and rubbed the dog's ears softly, gesturing for him to stay. Bear sat obediently by the wall, tail brushing the floor, his gaze never leaving Nathan as he entered the room. The dimly lit ICU felt warmer than the corridors outside, but the air carried the sterile scent of antiseptic mixed with faint traces of smoke from James's fire-damaged clothes. James Parker lay in the bed, his body thinner now, his lips pale and dry, and his shallow breaths rattled with every exhale. Tubes ran from his arms to IV bags that dripped rhythmically beside him. His hazel eyes opened slowly as Nathan approached, and despite the hollow exhaustion etched into his features, there was relief there too. "You came!" James rasped, his voice hoarse, almost broken. "I told you I would," Nathan replied softly, pulling a chair closer to the bed. James coughed, his body shaking under the weight of the effort, but a faint smile curved his lips when Nathan placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "How's Ethan?" James whispered, his voice trembling with both weakness and longing. Nathan's throat tightened as he glanced toward the glass panel across the room. Through it, he could see Ethan Parker, the tiny newborn he had rescued, sleeping peacefully in a neonatal crib. "He's safe," Nathan said finally, his voice low. "Emma's been helping to take care of him. He's warm, fed, and resting." James closed his eyes for a moment, and a faint sigh slipped from him. "Good. That's all I wanted." Emma stepped quietly into the room, carrying a small, carefully wrapped box. She approached the bed and placed it gently in James's hands. Inside lay Grace's wedding ring, a simple silver band, worn smooth with time. James lifted it with trembling fingers, his breath hitching slightly. "This was Grace's," he whispered, his voice breaking as he looked at Emma. His hazel eyes softened despite the pain. "I want you to have it. For Ethan. You've cared for him like he's your own." Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "James, Please," he interrupted, his voice fragile but firm. "Someday, when he's older, when he asks about his mother, give him this. Tell him she loved him enough to give her life bringing him here." Emma swallowed hard, nodding silently as tears filled her hazel eyes. She closed the small box and pressed it against her chest, promising without words to carry out his wish. James turned his attention back to Nathan, his thin fingers trembling as they reached for Nathan's hand. Nathan hesitated briefly before clasping it firmly, grounding him. James's grip was weak, but there was an urgency in his gaze, a plea deeper than words. "Promise me," James said, his voice a breath more than a sound. "Promise me Ethan will never grow up thinking we left him, that he'll know we loved him. Tell him Grace loved him. Tell him I—" He faltered, coughing hard, but Nathan leaned in, gripping his hand tighter, his own blue eyes shining with unspoken emotion. "I promise," Nathan said softly, his voice steady despite the tightness in his throat. "He'll know the truth, I swear it." A faint smile curved James's lips, a fragile sense of peace settling across his features. His breathing slowed, his chest rising and falling with gentle, shallow rhythms. He closed his eyes, his hand still resting weakly in Nathan's. Outside the room, the storm that had blanketed St. Paul for 2 straight days began to fade. The harsh winds subsided, and faint streams of pale light broke through the clouds, painting the hospital windows in soft gold. Bear shifted quietly outside the doorway, his ears twitching as though sensing the change. Inside, Nathan sat silently at James's bedside, his grip unmoving until the rise and fall of James's chest stilled entirely. Emma stood nearby, her hands clasped against the wedding ring box, her lips trembling as she blinked away tears. For a moment, there was only quiet, the kind of quiet that felt sacred, heavy with the weight of goodbyes. Nathan finally released James's hand, his eyes lowering toward the lifeless figure, honoring the man who had fought so hard for his son. From somewhere down the hall, a soft cry rose from Ethan's crib, delicate yet steady, as though reaching across the silence to remind them all that life continued. Nathan turned, his chest tight but resolute. There was no turning back now. James Parker's fight was over, but for Nathan and Ethan, a new chapter had only just begun. The winter sun hung low above St. Paul, its pale light brushing against the frozen rooftops and painting soft glows across the Mississippi River. The storm had passed, leaving a white silence over the city, interrupted only by the crunch of boots on fresh snow. A week had gone by since James Parker's funeral, and for Nathan Cole, life had shifted in ways he never thought possible. Nathan stood on the small porch of a modest one-story cabin, nestled at the edge of the woods, hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his worn flannel jacket. The cabin was old but sturdy, its dark cedar siding contrasting against the snowdrifts piled along the foundation. For the first time in years, Nathan wasn't returning to an empty home. Inside, Ethan Parker Cole, the tiny boy he had once found abandoned beneath the bridge, lay sleeping in a soft crib near the fireplace. The adoption had been finalized 2 days ago after a drawn-out meeting at the courthouse. Sheriff Thomas Reed, though reluctant at first, had handed over the verified papers once James's signed documents were confirmed. "Just make sure you give him a better life," the sheriff had said, his hazel eyes softening for perhaps the first time since Nathan had met him. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Emma Hayes moved quietly between the kitchen and the rocking chair by the window, cradling a small bottle of formula in her hand. Her wavy brown hair was tied back in a loose braid, and soft strands fell against her freckled cheeks as she leaned down to check on Ethan. Emma had moved into the cabin with Nathan and Bear, helping take care of Ethan while settling into this unexpected new chapter of her own life. Bear sprawled lazily across the rug, his thick black and tan fur still damp from a morning walk through the woods. His amber eyes followed Emma's every movement, his ears twitching whenever Ethan stirred in his sleep. Nathan stepped inside and shut the door against the cold, brushing snow from his boots. He watched Emma carefully lower herself into the rocking chair, holding Ethan gently as the baby let out a soft whimper. Nathan's pale blue eyes softened as he approached, resting one hand lightly on the chair's back. "He likes you more than he likes me," Nathan murmured with a faint smile. Emma laughed quietly, her voice soft and warm. "That's because I'm the one with the food," she teased, raising the bottle slightly. But then her tone shifted, becoming thoughtful. "He already feels safe here, Nathan. That's because of you." Nathan looked down at Ethan's small face, his lashes resting softly against his rosy cheeks. "I hope so," he whispered. James trusted me with his whole world. I hope I don't mess this up." Emma reached up and touched his arm gently. "You won't. You've already given him something no one else could, a second chance." For the first time in years, Nathan allowed himself to breathe deeply without the weight of loneliness pressing against his ribs. He thought of Lily. His daughter lost too soon, and for the first time, the memory didn't tear him apart. Instead, it felt like a quiet reminder, a promise fulfilled in a way he hadn't expected. 20 years later, snow blanketed St. Paul in deep, pristine layers as the Mississippi River glimmered faintly under the pale winter sun. On a quiet hill overlooking the river, a family stood together beneath the skeletal branches of leafless birch trees. Ethan Parker Cole, now 20 years old, stood tall and strong, his broad shoulders wrapped in a charcoal gray winter coat. His dark blonde hair framed a face marked by both youth and quiet determination, his pale blue eyes mirroring Nathan's. In his arms, he cradled a newborn, his first son, swaddled tightly in a soft white blanket. Beside Ethan, Nathan stood older now, his once dark hair fully peppered with gray, the sharp edges of his face softened by the passing years, but not diminished by them. Time had etched fine lines around his pale blue eyes, but they still carried the steady strength Ethan had always known. Bear was gone, but a new German Shepherd pup, Scout, just under a year old with a glossy black and tan coat, stood proudly at Nathan's side, ears perked and alert, as if carrying forward Bear's quiet legacy. Emma, now in her late 40s, stood nearby, her hazel eyes still warm, her hair tied loosely beneath a knitted scarf. Though time had added gentle lines around her eyes, her presence radiated the same unspoken strength that had carried them all through those early years. Ethan glanced down at the tiny boy in his arms and smiled faintly before whispering, "His name is James Cole, after the man who gave me life." Nathan swallowed hard, his chest tightening as he reached out and touched the baby's small hand. For a moment, the silence stretched between them, 3 generations bound by sacrifice, love, and second chances. On that snowy hill overlooking the Mississippi, Nathan thought of the night he had first found Ethan, of James's pale face, of the tiny wail in the cold, of the promise he had made beside a dying father. Now, as he watched Ethan hold his own son, Nathan felt that promise come full circle. Above them, the soft winter light broke through the clouds, touching the snow with faint gold. The air was quiet except for the distant sound of the river below. Love had endured. James's sacrifice, Grace's memory, Nathan's promise. None of it had been lost. It had only transformed, passed from one generation to the next, like a flame that refused to die. And here, in this moment, on this quiet St. Paul hill, the Cole family stood together, proof that love, no matter how fragile, always finds a way to live on. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or lightning. They arrive quietly, like a tiny baby's cry in the snow, a stranger's outstretched hand, or a promise made by a man who had already lost everything. In St. Paul, on that cold winter night, God's plan unfolded in ways no one could see at first. He led Nathan to little Ethan, gave James the strength to love his son enough to let him go, and built a new family out of broken hearts. And maybe that's the message for all of us. Even when life feels unbearable, even when the storm is raging, God is still writing your story. The pain you carry, the losses you've endured, the prayers you've whispered into the dark, none of them are wasted. Sometimes, He uses ordinary people to deliver extraordinary miracles. If you believe in hope, in second chances, and in the power of God's love, take a moment to pray for every child still waiting to be found, every parent still fighting for tomorrow, and every soul searching for a home. May God bless you and your family with peace, love, and miracles. If this story touched your heart, help us share it with the world. Comment where you're watching from and leave a prayer below. Like this video to help more people see it. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next story of faith, hope, and love. Share this video. You never know who might need to hear this today. Because sometimes, you could be the miracle someone is praying for.